Netflix's Avatar is a 10 out of 10 for me. I watched the first episode and it's already giving me 2010 vibes. On episode 4 and I'm sucked in. 5 out of 10. This show is amazing. The new show is everything I could have hoped and more. At worst, it makes the 2010 movie feel like a mercy. The people are divided. But luckily, I am objectively correct, and I'm here to tell you what to think. Okay, rapid fire, let's go. Overall, it's okay. It's better than the film which shall not be named. Anyone saying it's worse is wrong, but that does not mean this is well written. 5 to 6 out of 10, net positive, deeply flawed. If you're not thinking too hard, fun opening episodes, terrible middle episodes, one great episode, and enjoyable last couple of episodes. Terrible dialogue and script and exposition all throughout, hilariously bad at times, but this is somewhat hidden by the characters being likable and having chemistry. The best change, Zuko's crew is now the recruits he saved standing up to his father, and the worst change, they butchered the spirit world. When it's good, it's focused on the characters, not the plot, and it mixes the right stories in the right ways. This is why episode 6 is good, and when it's bad, it's mixing the wrong episodes in the wrong ways. This is why episode 5 is terrible. Much like One Piece, it's very honest about what it is. It's not afraid to be Avatar, but unlike One Piece, I think it puts a lot of emphasis in the wrong place at the wrong time. It's kind of a lukewarm version of the original, where it does most of the same story, just not quite as well. Even if it does it with a lot of heart and love, it'll still be fun for a lot of people, even if it's a little clumsy, and that's okay. You know, we enjoy a lot of stuff which isn't necessarily high quality. I'll do another big breakdown later in more detail, but I want to know, what do you think? Let me know down below. We're going to go through the good, the bad, and the okay. All right, let's go. Okay, the good. The bending looks fantastic. It does not look like... The firebending has heft and weight, and Ozai feels like the strongest bender out of all of the others. His flames hit harder, bigger, faster. Gordon's airbending is fluid, the waterbending feels powerful, the earthbending is a little more mixed, but the opening scene where you get to see it is really fantastic. And you can really see the influence of the martial arts and bending. They really put a lot of time and effort into that. There were also a lot of little moments where they blended the VFX with the actors to make them appear more fluid, animated, and I think those worked for the most part. Although one of the best fight scenes in the series actually doesn't have much bending in it at all. Zuko comes after Aang and Omashu, and they're tangled up in all these cloths and clothes, and there's a fun little moment where a woman comes along and bats Zuko for like hitting a child, and it feels animated. Zuko screams about Aang stealing his diary and comes after him, you know, which is very season 1 Zuko. He's trying to be mature, but he's ultimately a kid. That was where they got the vibes right, and this is important. There are a lot of moments in the series that work. Moments. The Avatar state does feel powerful. They pulled that off. They talked about changing how the Avatar state works, but that really just means using it less, which is good, and that Aang can only talk to his past avatars when he's in one of their shrines, which is fine. We'll just get to see a lot more avatars, mostly Kuruk and Kyoshi, and I think that actually works, though I wasn't a fan of how they handled Roku. Koizilla at the end is much more Zilla than Koi, but there's very much that primordial rage that I think they really tapped into, and I like that. The story is mostly loyal. They're clearly trying to keep the heart of the original show, even if it doesn't always land. I'll get to that. They basically cut Imprisoned, The Great Divide, The Fortune Teller, Butt of the Water Tribe, which are the right episodes to cut if you have to, and the only one that you really feel is missing is The Deserter, where Aang meets Zhong and he gets his fear of firebending because he hurts Katara. Sometimes they mix the right stories in the right ways, like in episode 6, they mix the blue spirit with the storm, and that actually does work. And episode 6 also happens to be the most loyal to the original series. Episode 6, honestly, it's a great episode. They move around some of the core beats, like Katara bringing Aang out of the Avatar state, like we see in the Southern Air Temple, is moved towards the end when she sort of brings him out of the Koizilla phase, reminding him as friends and loved ones, and that sort of reshuffling is okay. Whereas in the Southern Air Temple, Aang brings himself out of the Avatar state with Gyatso's help, which is the sort of thing I could imagine them doing in the original series. That sort of reshuffling's okay. Iroh coming with Zuko and saying everything he needs is right there on that boat, that's a beautiful expansion of what we already know. The scene where Zuko returns to the ship after rescuing Aang and his crew honor him, bowing before him as their prince, it's one of the best in the series. It genuinely moved me. And there are moments like this where it really does work. You know, this feels like not only a natural expansion to the story, but it works whether you know the original show or not. They do try to incorporate most of the main story and character beats, even if they don't land as hard as they did because of a lot of the framing or scripting, which I'll get to. They include a lot of stuff from the books and comics which came out later, which I appreciated as a fan, even if it didn't necessarily help the series. Some of the stuff they invented did work, like showing more of Iroh's backstory, Luten, Monkey Gyatso, even if I would have shown it at a different time. And also I liked the genocide, but I would have liked more They didn't feel that much more powerful with the comet. The main thing that makes me edge a little more positive is the characters. They have chemistry, they're likable on screen, they've got the vibes right in a way, especially Aang and Zuko. And there's a difference here between the acting and like the script they were given. They delivered those lines with all of their heart. I think they watered Katara down. I'll talk about that in a bit, but there's promise with all these characters. Zhao is a little bit different. He's this slimy little bottom feeder who's both incompetent and extremely dangerous, but he does what he's meant to. He's meant to make Zuko look honest by comparison. Every character's a little different, but Zhao was the only one that I was like really comfortable with being different. They also give Azula her own story. This was something I said I was generally in favor of. You know, she's basically just pops up in season 2, bring her to season 1, not a bad idea. But they're trying to play up how Ozai doesn't care about either of his kids. He manipulates Azula as much as he does Zuko, just in different ways, and that's what drives her to madness. This is something the comics delve into a bit more, that he doesn't really love her, he just loves how useful she is. This is a change I like in concept, less so in execution. It suffers from the same scripting, lack of subtlety problems we'll get to, but I don't think we should see her as ticked off as she gets in the series so easily. She's not meant to be this easily tiffed, but this also might be an example of something where it's like different but not necessarily bad, and I feel like we need to wait and see a bit, because obviously I'm comparing it against a complete story. If I was to say the live action accomplished what it set out to do, which is bring an animated classic into a new medium with a new vision, building on what was, then it did this in, I think, the production design, you know, costume, settings. They pay homage to the original designs in so many ways, but a lot of the time they build on them quite nicely too. Like the Grove and the Northern Water Tribe becomes this sort of mini valley I quite liked. Omashu is similar, but not identical. Takeshi Furukawa did an incredible job with the music, taking the motifs and songs we know, but building on them, threading in like little bits of leaves from the vine into Iroh's episodes. You might say it doesn't matter much, but that definitely changes the feel and tone and the immersion of the world. The biggest plus is it's honest. It's not afraid to be cheesy. It's clearly made by people who love the original material. It's not ashamed to be Avatar. Its heart is definitely in the right place, even to its detriment. Now, you will notice I didn't really praise the writing a lot, and that's because the bad. They messed up the spirit world. So in the show, Aang finds a burned down forest, then the village being terrorized by Heibai, confronts Heibai, sets it to right before he learns he needs to go and talk to Roku in the Fire Nation, where he learns about the comet. In the process, dealing with his grief and learning something really important for his duty as the Avatar. It's an amazing couple of episodes. In the Netflix show, they find the burned down forest and then the village and then go to find Heibai, but then they bump into Wan Shi Tong, but then Sokka and Katara get kidnapped by Ko the Face Stealer, and so Aang has to go to the Fire Nation to talk to Roku to find out how to beat Ko the Face Stealer to rescue Sokka and Katara. And the spirit world is just the forest tinted blue. They mixed all the wrong plots in the wrong ways here. It takes all of the exposition and plot bloat, but none of the depth that makes this stuff meaningful and kind of cheapens all of their stories. It's just sort of feels like references, almost like fan service. Like Heibai is basically rushed past. He feels kind of like an animal that's just sort of there. And even though he looks great, he's kind of just sidelined for Ko. In the original show, Aang and Heibai both kind of have to come to terms with the world they knew no longer being there and find a new way to move past this grief. This is what I mean by the show has a lot of the core beats, because this moment is technically in the Netflix show, but it doesn't hit as hard because it's kind of rushed past, and Ko the Face Stealer is way more important. We have to worry about that now. And Aang isn't really thinking about his grief that much. It doesn't have that character dimension. Wan Shi Tong is there, but only because they're probably not going to do the library episode and they wanted to get him in somehow, but he doesn't have the intrigue and gravitas. He's just there to give Aang exposition. Exposition we don't need. And Ko is turned from this interesting, morally grey, ancient spirit of unknowable power and knowledge who helps the Avatar in a critical moment to just kind of an evil obstacle, especially because they remove the need to keep a straight face and the subplot kind of just hijacks the story. Then Roku's place as Aang's mentor is kind of given to Kyoshi, which I don't actually think is inherently bad. It feels like the need to go talk to Roku is really just put in there because it's in the original show and not because it's naturally fit for this plot line. You know, Aang suddenly going over to the Fire Nation and it seemingly being basically no issue whatsoever. It kind of cheapens it. Like Aang rescuing Sokka and Katara from Ko doesn't feel that important for his character development, it just feels like something he has to now do. It sometimes gets lost in these moments of fanfic or fan service that it forgets why the original show did something a certain way. Like they gave us Gyatso vs Sozin, but seemingly the sacrifice of that reveal for Aang at the Southern Air Temple. This whole story also exemplifies something of the worst parts of the adaptation, because the story constantly sidetracks to try and mishmash all these different episodes. It's trying to cut between different plot lines and then try to weave them together, but it doesn't always manage to do that very well, because it's Aang, going to save the village by talking to Heibai, but no, it's not. It's actually Aang needs to go and save Sokka Katara from Ko the Face Stealer, but no, it's not, because Aang needs to get to the Fire Nation, but no, it's not. Aang gets captured and needs to escape, but in order to get back to save Ko. Save Katara and Sokka from Ko. All these stories end up being stunted and cut short in their own ways. I'm really not sure why Ko had to be here, why he couldn't be at the Northern Watertribe in his original role, or why, even if you didn't want to do the comet, because they don't apparently want to do the comet reveal just yet, why not have Roku calling to Aang and then he reveals that, you know, that the moon is in danger and foreshadows that. And frankly, Wan Shi Tong doesn't feel like it naturally fits here. It's mostly there because they know you know it from the original series. There's a lot of just plot, and it can feel a bit bloated at times. They end up mixing the episodes Jet, Omashu, and the Mechanist, the Northern Air Temple. And this is actually not, like, conceptually not a bad way to combine the stories, but they fracture it in a way that a lot of the characters don't have anything to do with these plots. Like, Sokka basically doesn't talk to Jet at all. He doesn't really have any interaction, barely. And so when he and Katara clash over, you know, that, it doesn't have the depth that it did in the show, where all of the characters were all dealing with Jet. Again, they do include these plot beats, but not always enough for the context. This isn't always the issue, but it's a recurring enough issue for you to notice. Like, I was watching the Jet stuff and he calls Katara naive, but I was like, you haven't really seen that much. It only makes sense in my head because I know what actually happened in the series. I think the plot bloat was most noticeable in the Secret Tunnel episode, where Sokka and Katara are heading into the tunnels to find Aang, and I actually had to stop and pause myself. I was like, wait, why are they in the tunnels again? And the answer is because it's in the series and they wanted to do that. And you can see that earnestness there, but it also doesn't help sometimes. It would have been better to extend the Jet and Mechanist plotline while Aang is dealing with Bumi. Even though some of the extra backstory scenes with Zuko, Iroh, or Aang do work, bringing them in so early doesn't. The order in which we learn these things often robs them of their impact. The clearest example being Aang isn't revealed as the Avatar with all the hope that brings when Katara and Sokka learn it, because the show already told us that he is the Avatar in the backstory before the story started. Even though they didn't need to, part of the reason backstory is usually found later is because it's only given meaning by the context of a character's actions and motivations later in the story, like Aang hiding his real identity. That's interesting, but we don't get that, even though they managed to understand this in episode 6 with Zuko. But the biggest issue the series has is dialogue and script and exposition. It is genuinely quite bad throughout the entire series. There's this moment where Gran gives an expositional speech, much of which we already know, and it's really heavy-handed, and weirdly, it's also the opening credits Katara speech, but they already did one that's like the off-brand version of Katara's speech. Characters end up saying what they feel. There's a lot of telling and not showing. And that's what I mean by, like, the characters do the best with the lines they're given. Like, they deliver these lines with heart and you kind of like them, but the lines are really bad a lot of the time. Sometimes there's exposition which is just entirely unnecessary and they just add it in. Like, part of this is like the Ko story where he's like, Ko hunts in the fog of lost souls and this is the fog of lost souls. And it's like, that's a great little piece of tidbit of lore, but we really didn't need that. Or how this is a special type of moon, that the moon and ocean, that's why they can be killed now, and it's got a special knife to kill them with. Sometimes the exposition is a nice little nod to the lore that I would get because I know this stuff, but if you're unfamiliar with it, it'll just feel like bloat. They spoon-feed a lot of stuff the show originally left as subtext, which is partly why, while I like Azula having more of a role, I don't like how they did it. Heart in the right place, execution, It never lets you wonder about the characters or be intrigued by their motivations, figuring them out, their inner feelings, because they will just straight up tell you what they're thinking. Don't worry, you won't miss a thing. And the remixing of the lines in the script sometimes gives individual scenes some really weird timing. Like, you know the moment where Iroh goes, "Zhao, let the spirit go. Anything you do to it, I'll leash on you tenfold." Well, he does that in the series, okay? But he says that, and then he lets Zhao, like, pick up the thing and threaten it and go, "I am the Moon Slayer." And then only a little after does he act. Why not just have him say that later? Or they do the scene where Aang takes out the single Fire Nation ship in the north before realizing there's a whole armada out there, and he has this moment of hopelessness, and he goes, "I'm just a boy." They do both of those moments, but those lines are split up into weird places that mean that they don't quite land as hard as either of them could because they're meant to be together. Again, they do include those beats that matter, but it's just not quite right, and they don't quite land as well. Of all the characters, I actually really liked Aang and Zuko, especially Dallas Yu, but I think they fumbled Katara a little. She gets watered down. She's meant to be full of passion and forthrighteousness and feminine rage and traumatic rage, but we don't get those little moments like Katara's rage shattering the ice that frees Aang, or even in her duel with Parku, which we do get. She's not quite as angry and full of fury. I think they wanted to avoid doing the emotional angry woman trope, but they ended up kind of neutering her. Sokka's arc is better than I expected. I know that everyone's really worried about them removing Sokka's sexism and all that, but they do give him an arc of, like, trying to find out his skills. He's a planner and an inventor and a leader, more than necessarily just a warrior. That said, in the Kyoshi Warriors episode, you do feel the absence of that sexism arc, because basically it just means that him and Suki hit it off because she has a crush on the cute foreign boy, which, I mean, to my mind is even more sexist. There's also, and this is one of the weirdest changes that they made, a distinct lack of Aang learning any waterbending ever. He and Katara basically never train together. They never learn waterbending together. It just doesn't happen. Katara basically gets the waterbending scroll at the start, and that's pretty much the only way we see her improving her waterbending. She doesn't get to train with Parku. I don't quite know what they're planning to do with this. I'm very skeptical, but I think this is maybe a wait and see. Most of the arcs are there in some way, but they're lukewarm versions of what we know and love. Like Aang running away from being the Avatar is muted by him not running away from the temples and getting stuck in the ice. Katara does grow to engage with the trauma, but she's not as feisty and doesn't learn from Parku. And Sokka, while he does learn a lot about himself, he's not humbled. The okay. Alright, so I was initially a lot more negative on Bumi. Bumi in the original show is this kooky, goofy, but still very lovable old man who puts Aang through a bunch of trials to teach him to think differently. In the Netflix show, he's an unlovable, corrupt politician who has lost all hope in the world and blames Aang for running away. And instead of him teaching Aang a lesson, Aang teaches him a lesson that you can rely on your friends and you should have hope and you should continue the fight. This is a change I had a very negative reaction to at first, because it's never nice to have a character you like turned into someone this unlikable. But I do see what they're trying to do with it, and I think this might be a case of just because it's different doesn't mean it's worse. And my love for the original series might be interfering with that judgment there, because this does speak to a broader tonal change in the series. Everyone outside of Aang, Katara, and Sokka are way more depressed and miserable. Kyoshi Island, Chief Arnook, the past avatars, Iroh, Parku, and most clearly Bumi. They're really playing up that this is a hopeless world ever since the Avatar left it, and that Aang is meant to be hope returning to it, that he brings hope everywhere he goes. I don't think I agree with people who say that like Aang isn't happy or goofy enough. They clearly put that into the series. I think they're confusing the overall tone of the series, which is a bit grimmer, and there is sometimes where that grimmer tone does pay off. There's a scene where Iroh gets to talk to one of the soldiers, or a relative of the soldier who fought at Ba Sing Se, the city which he sieged, and he's like, hey, you butchered people. And I think that's actually one of the better scenes in the show. It's a really interesting way to build on that scene in the series. But if they do want to have that Aang is bringing joy, then I need to see that joy in others more. Like at the end of the Kyoshi episode, she basically just goes, hey, you made us happy, and waves happily goodbye. But we don't actually see that joy. It's a lot of tell and a lot of show. The question on a lot of people's minds, is it worth it? Was this necessary? And I don't know. I think trying to adapt an animated series into live action inevitably just shows you why the series is animated in the first place. And I also hate the trend of adapting animated classics into live action as if it's somehow a better medium. It's disrespectful. Animation is amazing and has so many great qualities that only become more visible in projects like this. If they wanted to do a live action story, then do a new one about a different avatar, or even Aang later in life. It would have been better and not face the same immeasurable expectations this series did that kind of shot it in the foot. But we live in an age of remakes and prequels and regurgitations, and you can feel the cracks of that. It being fun and honest doesn't mean it's not clumsy. The bottom line is the show is okay, and there's room for improvement. It's well known that seasons 2 and 3 are typically stronger than season 1. Season 1 is a lot more fragmented and has some of the weaker episodes, so we might see that in the second season. Some of the additions and changes work, others are bizarre. I think it's interesting if you love the original show, but I think it needs some significant improvements if it's going to stand independent of its source material. It definitely feels a little bit weird and clunky if you don't know the source material. I wouldn't call it a disappointment. Obviously, when things don't work, it is disappointing. But overall, it's just kind of okay. And I'm like, oh, all right, seems like kind of a first draft. Maybe a second draft would do better. But I want to know what you think. Let me know down in the comments below. Stay nerdy, and I'll see you in the future.